Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. So glad you're here. Today we're making the Stranger helmet from the series The Acolyte. So stick around and I'll show you how it's done.
Voiceover time. Okay, we've got our slicer open. I'm using Bamboo Studio. My printer is a Bamboo Labs P1P, and the filament I'm using is Sunlu PLA Black. All right, as you can see here, I've got variable layer height going, and what this does is it slows the printer down and reduces ringing on the top of the model, which makes it easier to sand. Once I feel good about that, I will slice it, and this will add my supports. And we're just gonna check and look at this, make sure everything's good to go, make sure all the supports are gonna print properly. You can see I'm using that slider on the right, which will go layer by layer and let me see how it's gonna do. Everything's looking pretty good, so let's send it off to the printer. Okay, it's time to get this stuff off the printer. Usually just falls right off the build plate. Sometimes I have a little trouble getting the supports off. I had not a great setting for that, but overall, everything's coming out looking really, really good. Next step is going to be gluing everything up. Okay, let's get this model put together. As you can see, I've got some parts glued together, but I noticed I've got some stringing at the top that's really going to be annoying once it's time to fit another part in there. So just taking an X-Acto knife and cleaning it up. I'm using regular CA glue. Any super glue will work just fine to make this work. And yeah, I think it's going to come out really, really nice.
All right, here it is, all glued up. Man, this is an incredible model. I cannot wait to start doing the detail work and all of that. Man, it looks so good. It looks so good. We've got some of these, you know, just the layering up here at the top that we need to deal with, and a little bit here in the back. Shouldn't be a problem at all. And I love that this model is so textured and beat up. It's really gonna help hide layer lines. But we're gonna get to smoothing it out as best we can. All right, we've got our helmet all glued together and ready for sanding. We've got our detail sander here with 180 grit sanding pad on there. We're using 180. Normally I'd use a lower grit to start and then work my way up, but we printed this at a low layer height and I think it's gonna work just fine. And I don't wanna take too much material off because of all the detail, like these welds and things like that. So we're really just trying to knock down some of this ringing on the top and on the back and get just any overly high spots knocked down. Another tool we're gonna need is a respirator or a mask. Once you start sanding, it really kicks up a lot of small pieces of plastic. You don't want to be breathing that in. Either if you're inside, definitely wear a respirator, and if not, stand outside where it's a nice ventilated area and the wind can blow things away. But even then, I'd still recommend wearing a respirator. So with all that being said, let's get into it. All right, our prop is all finished. It's all sanded up. I think it's looking pretty good. Like I said earlier, you can see there's some banding there and some more banding here. But for the most part, it's looking really good. I think filler primer, a few coats of filler primer are gonna do the job at hiding these layer lines. One of the steps we need to do now is knock all the dust off. So I have a grease and wax remover here, and we're just gonna wipe this down. I've got a microfiber cloth, something that's not gonna leave any residue on your prop. You wanna do this in between most of your steps, particularly after sanding if you're gonna paint. Sanding obviously knocks up a bunch of particles and a lot of dust, and that could really mess up your paint job. Primer, for the most part, is gonna stick over it, but it's just always better to be safe than sorry. This stuff is cheap. I think it was like 10 bucks. I can't remember how much it was, but it's cheaper than the time it takes to have to repaint or resand it and repaint afterwards. It's just a pain. And I've learned that lesson the hard way. I've had many paint jobs fail, and my success rate with paint jobs after using this wax and grease remover has gone way higher. So I very much encourage you, wipe down your prints or your props after each step. All right, this guy is good to go. Next thing we're gonna do is we are gonna use some spot glazing putty to hide some of these lines. We're gonna kind of rough it up a little bit so it kind of blends in with the texture of the helmet.
All right, as our first step of getting rid of some of these lines, we're using Bondo glazing spot putty. This is really designed for like really small pinholes in your paint or really small blemishes. But this works well if you apply it in a few layers just to cover up some of these big layer lines. For gaps and fills, I use regular Bondo, but this dries really fast and sands really well. I'm also adding a little bit of texture here just to make sure it looks like it's part of the helmet. I don't want this to be perfectly smooth. I'm not trying to sand this down to look like a stormtrooper helmet or anything like that. This needs to look like it's beat up, and I think it's coming out pretty good.
All right, so we've gotten done with this step. Now we're moving on to primer. Couple things about primer. I'm using this cheap Rust-Oleum primer. Honestly, you can spend more money. The real difference is in the quality of how it sands. This stuff will tend to gum up your sandpaper and can be a little annoying to sand, although I don't think we're gonna be doing a lot of sanding on this helmet, which is why I'm just going with the cheap stuff. But more expensive stuff tends to sand really nice and not gum up your sandpaper, which means you use less sandpaper. Either way, this is what we're going with. Let's hit it with some primer together.
Filler primer is dried. It has done a great job filling in those gaps. Now it's time for some flat black primer. One thing to note, I did a bit of like what's called a dust coat on the top. It's just a very light dusting of paint before you lay it on super thick. Here it is. Well, it's all done. It's all dried out. The flat black looks amazing on here. Honestly, it looks so good. What we're gonna do next, we're gonna mask off just so these teeth are exposed, and then we're gonna hit it with some gloss black and get ready to spray some Duralumin on those teeth. Make it look chrome. It's gonna be sick. Let's head on over to the bench. As I'm getting this taped up and actually editing this video, I realized I probably could have done this in a little bit of a different way. Maybe painted all of these parts and done all these parts separately before I glued them together. Either way, this is what we were left with. I'm hitting it with some Krylon gloss black, and now it's time to hit it with that Duralumin, one of my favorite chrome paints. A lot of people use Duralumin or Alumiluster. I've got Duralumin Tough, and just laying it on in a couple light coats here until it starts to look really chrome. You know, we got Smilo Ren over here. He's looking pretty good. Now it's time for my favorite part, which is laying down the base coat. I'm using Spanish Copper Rub and Buff on a really cheap brush. And the idea here is I'm just lightly going over the surface and letting the model pick up the color. I'm not trying to lay this on super thick. It's real important to have those valleys where there's not a lot of paint there. It adds that contrast and lets the model read really well. And what's so cool about this helmet is it's made of some kind of metal. I forget the name of it, but it basically shorts out lightsabers, and it's got this kind of gold copper hue to it, which is really cool. And so I just want to make sure I'm mimicking that, but not overdoing it. Now it's time to do the gouges and the cracks in the helmet. Looking at the screen, it's got kind of a reddish copper hue to it. I've got my reference photo up there just to make sure I'm kind of aiming for the right thing. I'm using some war paint. It's actually stuff that they use to paint Warhammer and small miniatures, but I love this paint because it's not super thick and it lays and covers really well. So I've got a copper metallic paint, and I've also got a red paint there, just mixing those two in and trying to match the color. The other thing you'll see me doing is using a paper towel. And what I'm doing there is I've got some water on it, and it's a water-based paint. So if I make a mistake or go outside the lines, I will just wipe that off and you'll look like it was never there. I also want to say when you're doing stuff like this, don't overthink it. Have fun, be creative, make it your own, and don't try to be too perfect with it. Most cosplay props are going to be seen from about 5 feet away at most, at closest, I guess you could say. And so it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. We're not pinstriping here. We're just trying to make it look like this thing has been beat to heck. Now it's time to start on these welds that are kind of raised up, and they look haphazard. You know, the whole thing about this model is it's handmade. It's made in a cave somewhere. So it should look haphazard. It should look like it's a mess. And so we don't want those welds to look perfect. I'm leaving a lot of space and adding and leaving some shadows in there. And I think that's important. It helps those read. We want this to look like it was poorly made by a guy who doesn't know anything about welding. And you can see me here checking my reference photo, making sure I've got the colors right, making sure it's going to pop and look appropriate. Now that we have the welds finished and looking right, it's time to put a little bit of a black wash on there just to get down in the crevices. And again, shadows help the readability of your prop. And so I'm just got a really, really thin bit of black paint thinned out with water, and I'm running it over the top and then wiping it away. And as you can see, that black kind of settles in to the deep spaces and the small little cracks and crevices on those parts on the model. Finally, I wasn't super happy with how dark things were, so I'm adding some bright silver to make them shine and pop a little bit more. And once we're done with this, it is time for clear coat. I'm using a satin clear coat here in my airbrush. This is again made for small models, but you can use any type of satin semi-gloss clear coat. Once this is done, it is time for some beautiful B-roll footage, baby. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.